what it is we have a culture now that treats heterosexuality as something morally inferior to an alternative sexual identity.
Today on the Strong Women Podcast, we are actually joining forces and combining Strong Women Podcast with the Maven Parent Podcast. So we have invited, Sarah and I have kindly invited our husbands back on the Strong Women Podcast / Maven Parent Podcast today. If you have not listened to our first episode with our husbands, go back to season 1. I think it's episode 7, 8, or 9, one of those in the beginning. But you can go back and get kind of an intro of our husbands, our marriages, and you could see why Sarah and I were a little bit afraid to let them back in the studio with us.
Ladies, how does it feel to have to be in the presence of two presidents?
Two presidents. It's intimidating.
I like how they're talking about like how kind they are to have us on the podcast. We were the most popular podcast of the whole year that year. What, right?
I don't know about that.
Or maybe people have given me the demographics I wanted to see.
Yeah, your fans have been clamoring for this.
Yes.
They have been, yes.
We did truthfully hear a lot of good feedback about the episode that we kindly invited you guys to. So we thought we would kindly extend the invitation again to you guys. And we, as Sarah and I were talking about having you guys and thinking about, okay, what will we talk about with them? What would be good? Of course, the topic of gender came up because both of you in your line of work, what?
I just was thinking of something sarcastic to say.
Oh.
And I stopped myself.
Okay.
And I just smiled instead.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that was
that was a lot of self-control.
That
right
was
there.
good.
I think what he was thinking, which I will say, because it's kind of obvious, is that you thought of us because we are so manly.
Oh my gosh.
Plus, we identify as males.
We do, yes.
So
we continue to identify with that which we were assigned at birth.
That is all true. Also, you guys talk about this, as I was saying before you started smirking at me. You both are thinking about this topic of gender and culture, of course, in what you do. John is president of Colson Center. Brett, you as president of Maven and working with students and parents, all that you guys are doing. And your book, of course, that you guys wrote together, Practical Guide to Culture and Student Guide to Culture, addresses this topic of gender, which when you guys wrote the book was a topic in the culture. And when Sarah and I started the Strong Women Podcast, it was a topic in the culture. But now it has obviously, as you know, exploded. And we didn't realize just the title, Strong Women Podcast, could potentially be controversial at one point, just because we actually are claiming that being a woman is something objective, that there is this thing. And so we thought we'd bring you guys on, talk about this topic, of course, get a male perspective on what's going on, assuming there is such a thing as a male perspective that could possibly be different than a female perspective. But we were talking about some stories that have come up that we've heard about, and we wanted your guys' thoughts on these. So one, Brett, is from a youth pastor in Southern California where we live, and him saying that in his youth group now,
particularly in the middle school group.
In the middle school group,
all
that's
the
right.
Middle school girls now identify as something on the acronym. LGBTQ.
Something on the acronym, yeah. So bisexual in some way is basically what he was saying. That all the girls in his youth group now. And that was a little stunning to hear. But of course, we've been hearing more and more stories like this. And Sarah, there was a story you heard
Well,
too.
at church on Sunday, our pastor came up to us and said, hey, let's do something about gender especially for the parents and the students going back to school this year, because he had two families that go to a classical charter school in town the charter schools kind of avoided this topic, getting too much in the weeds of it so far. But this year they came in full force and up front are saying we're going to use pronouns, and they have bought into the agenda. And and so we wanted to talk about that, for thinking about our listeners who are parents or students or grandparents or teachers themselves. And I mean, that's just one arena of culture that's really struggling with this right now. But we wanted to just talk to you guys about, like, let's look at that. Let's look at the that demographic and talk to them about how to tackle this. And, and why is maybe we could start here. So I'm reading what's her name? Hold on. Abigail Favali's new book, Genesis of Gender. And in it, she's talking about, in one section, she's saying that the Christian worldview is the only origin story that gives identity and purpose. And so she kind of matches it with other origin stories that either just, humans are basically an accident, or actually the problem, or all these different things that actually don't give identity. So that's what I wanted to start with is why is that true? Why is Christianity the one that gives identity? What does she mean by that? John? You remember that section?
Oh yeah, no, she does, but it's true. I mean, you can go through, for example, you could go through each and every origin story, but if you just go through the large groupings of worldviews, like secular naturalism, there's not a purpose to anything. So if there's not a purpose to anything, there's not a purpose to humanity, and there's no substantive difference between animals and humans. So what animals have to do, eat, sleep, mate, then that really is the reductionistic way that secular philosophers have understood what it means to be human, that we're just basically consumers of resources, that we are just physical creatures trying to meet physical instincts. And that's led to a whole trail of thought within the sexual revolution that's trickled down to pop culture. And so that's where that comes from. It's not purpose, it's what is. Most of the research about sexual behavior in humans during the 20th century was about what is, not about what ought to be, or about whether what is harms us in some way. The assumption was, if it's what we do, then it's natural, and that reflects a vision of life in the world that's kind of absent of any morality. If you go to kind of pantheisms, any form of, what we call transcendentalism, this idea that everything is God, then, there's if everything is God, then everything is God, and there's nothing distinct or unique about the sexual behavior of humans as opposed to anything else, any other living creature. So it kind of blurs all those distinctions. It also blurs the distinctions between male and female. So you get that out of kind of Eastern religions, in kind of an Eastern worldview. Postmodernism, basically chalks everything up to words referring to words, and nothing ever referring to bedrock reality. So you can, if there is a purpose, you'd never know it, right? So, I mean, all worldviews pretty much group into those categories. I mean, there's probably some outliers of polytheisms, but they fall into the same problem. You have in Christianity humans as a unique, distinct creation. And then if you get within theistic worldviews, which of course these are worldviews that posit the existence of God. So that's Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Is the Judeo-Christian origin story is the same. Islam sees humans as basically not playing a significant role in carrying out the will of God. God is in control. It's a very transcendent view of God. But Christianity, God literally goes, hey, here's the keys to the world. Now go take care of it. Here's what I want. I want this empty and formless place to be filled and formed. You go fill and form it. What could possibly go wrong? There's an awful lot of authority. In fact, that's the word that's used in Genesis 1. Let them rule. And they're going to rule as male and female. So the whole story is absolutely profound. And we've read it so much we're bored with it. But if you keep in mind, like, the first people that are receiving this story as their own is the children of Israel, who just spent the last 500 years hearing that there's many gods, that they're basically just peons and slaves because they're not, Egyptians, and they're hearing this like this is brand new information. This is stunning information that they're not really slaves; they're lords. Small L, but what a profound thing. So yeah, it's a really important point, and it's an important point that we rule as male and female. So before we know Eve's name, we know that she's in the image of God too. That's something profoundly pro-woman in the origin story that is unparalleled in any other origin story.
Yeah. First, I want to clarify. I'm not with John. I don't get bored when I read the origin story. You may, but
You're spiritual.
Every day I read it, and I'm just fascinated by the work of the
You
Lord.
don't have it memorized yet? You should memorize it like us.
There's that male competitive nature coming out.
Mm-hmm.
This is a time to connect right now, John. We're trying to connect. No, I think I love everything that John says.
Of course you do.
Gosh,
I
why
was
did
going
I
to say
set you up for
everything
that?
that John says.
Make sure that little sentence does not get edited out right there.
Well, I was going
All
to
right,
say,
thanks.
except
Did you
for the
mean
part.
said, or like in general you love everything?
Everything.
No,
I
I
always
everything he
say-
says, except for the stuff on God and religion and worldview. I was going to say this is why it's so important for us to reflect on the nature of God, the nature and existence of God, because that's where it all originates. And here, our view of God is we have a personal creator, right? Not some distant, ambiguous being who has just spun the world into existence, but there's a personal creator here. There's a creator with intention. He's a personal agent, and there was intention in his design of the world and of the creatures. And because you have God as the necessary and sufficient cause of all that exists, then you'll see that then gives us an explanation for why we have a universe filled with purpose. Mm-hmm. Right? John's right. The secular humanist view, something grounded in some kind of evolutionary biology where there is no mind, there is no end-directed, purpose. There's no telos. You can't get from that cause then purpose in the universe. That cause is not sufficient to give that to you. But God, as an agent with intention, with purpose, he loads the universe with purpose right from the very get-go. And so, human beings have this end-directed purpose, or they have this, these goals. They being made male and female, there's a end-directed purpose to those things. And so this is where I think, as Christians, our reflections, our study, our meditation on who God is so important, because that then informs and helps illuminate the world around us. As we understand who God is and what he's like, then we understand how he's made us and how creation reflects the glory of God.
It seems to me that I think probably a lot of people listening would agree. Okay, we agree with what you guys are saying. I think help people to connect then, like this origin story and then why it matters with our identity and like identifying who we are and saying, what it means to be a woman. It just seems like in the culture, there's this disconnect of like, yeah, you can think that we're created by God. That's great. And okay, yeah, I believe that, but my identity is going to be in what I decide it to be or whatever. So there is that disconnect that I see even in the church.
Yeah.
So can you guys connect that a little bit?
Of course we can.
Oh my gosh.
Actually, I think we can tap into people's some basic intuitions that are common sense that just gets knocked out of us by the culture. And so, and this is where analogies are very helpful. If you think about it, what something is, understanding what something is, what helps you in that whole task? Well, figuring out where it comes from, like what's its origin. In fact, the origin or the originator will give you a lot of insight that you otherwise would not have on that thing. And so understanding the nature of things is connected back to the origin of those things. So for instance, we have appliances at home, right? And we use them all the time. And we understand whether it's your toaster or whether it's your washing machine or, whatever it might be, these things they have a certain purpose and they are to function in a certain kind of way. And there's boundaries on how it can function. So, here's an analogy, I use all the time is our washing machine at home.
Are you sure you want to use this one?
I used this last week. I'm just going to go ahead and preempt John's comments here. Okay. Yes, I have used our washing machine at our house at least a couple of times. Okay. But here's, we've got this washing machine at our house. It's amazing. Throw in dirty clothes, put in some laundry detergent, push a couple of buttons, and that thing functions in such a way that at the end of that washing cycle, you get clean clothes. It's amazing. Now, there are other dirty things at our house. There are tools that we use, tools that I use on the car or, whatever it might be. I can say, oh gosh, here's dirty tools. Let me throw those in the washing machine and try to clean those. Now, of course, we know if I do that, what's going to happen to the machine?
I feel like you're speaking from experience. Did you try
deep
this before?
Experience. All those tools I use to fix all of my cars.
And put them in the washing
I was about to
machine.
say,
I think
the most
that's what I'm
the
talking
most
about.
implausible part of the story is that Brett has tools. So.
Okay, don't derail this amazing analogy that the audience needs to hear to understand this deep question. Okay, so we know that if I use that machine in a way it wasn't intended to function, it's going to break down. It may not break down the first time I wash my tools in there, but eventually, if it functions improperly enough times, it will break down. And so how do I know how that thing is to function properly? Well, I consult the designer, right? And so the designer of the washing machine, he's actually written a manual. He's given us detailed instructions on how this thing should properly function. You go outside of that proper function, the thing breaks down. And so we connect the proper function of something, the end goal of that thing, to its origin all of the time. We consult the designer all of the time without even maybe consciously recognizing. Mm-hmm. And so that's why this is so important. You want to know how human beings should properly function and live and ultimately flourish. You have got to know what the design plan was for these creatures.
I think your question, it points out something that's very, very important for people to understand. Christians, for parents, and that is how much we suck in the cultural air in which we live. There are three forces that have really driven the gender issue. Because you're right, when we wrote A Practical Guide to Culture, gender was a big issue. Today, it went from being, a prominent part of the LGBT train to now being the engine that almost drives everything else, particularly culturally. I think back to 2009, it's 13 years ago. That's one of the first projects I worked with Chuck Colson. The rollout of something called the Manhattan Declaration, which was a statement of life, marriage, and religious liberty. And the question of should we say something about gender came up in that whole process. And everyone was like, that's just too extreme. It's a real thing, but it's not here yet. And they were right. I mean, it would have, put that document into the category of fearmongers. And even at the Obergefell decision, which was 2015, people were like, this is going to mean all this other stuff. And everyone's like, no, it won't. And you're just poisoning the well. And here we are, And it's really because of three forces. And that what I think we need to understand. The first is secularism, because that disconnect between the origin story and how we see the world is an infectious disease across Christians. It is secularism becomes a way of thinking about the world as if God is largely irrelevant to its most important questions. Secularism doesn't disprove Christianity. It dismisses it. It privatizes it. So suddenly, no matter how many times you say, the Bible says this in Genesis 1, everyone basically assumes that what you think when it comes to God, morality, and religion is personal and private, that you're not actually saying something that's true about life in the world. And And if that's the case, then I have no right to infringe upon your deep conscience or what you believe about something. And that's just infectious. I remember somebody saying this in college, and it's more true now than then, is that most Christians are just secularists with a twist. We don't understand when we're talking about Christianity that we're actually talking about a description of reality, you know. The other two pieces here that I think are really important were actually, I was just thinking about this, the two stories you guys told at the beginning. You know, you talking about all the kids in the youth group, and then the question, the story, and then the story that Sarah brought up from our church about a charter school. And the interesting thing about this charter school in town is that they told a prospective, same charter school told a prospective parent, that another one that I know, that, oh no, we don't talk about gender theory in school. That's just not something we talk about. That's up to the parents. And then she said, well, what if another student says, here are my pronouns? What's my student expected to do?
Good question.
And the answer was, oh, you have to use the pronouns of the student. So in other words, get what this means. We're not going to talk about gender theory. We're going to assume it's already been decided. We're not going to talk about our views on this. We're just going to enforce our views on this as if they're the only rational, acceptable views. That has increasingly happened in our culture. This is the force of the sexual revolution. So you get secularism and the sexual revolution. The sexual revolution presumes this whole new way of thinking about life in the world, as if the science is settled, as if the conversation is over, as if sex has nothing to do with babies, as if people are not really male and female, as if there is a real category of human beings that are cisgender and transgender, and a real way of describing sexual orientation as gay or straight. These are completely 20th century made up, late 20th century made up categories that we've now presumed are the correct way to understand life in the world. Conversation over, the science is settled. We're going to enforce it with the power of law. Parents need to understand. That's what I mean when I say that the T has gone from being one of the carts on the train to driving the train. Conversation's over. The other factor, and this is really important because your story about the youth group, we heard where all the junior, because your story about the youth group where everyone identifies as somewhere along the acronym, we just heard that as well from a theologian friend about a junior high classroom in the Northeast. And you think about that, I don't know if you remember, some of us are old enough to remember when, you know, the media proclaimed 10% of the population is gay because of the Kinsey report, which of course was bogus because they were studying prostitutes and prisoners. And then the numbers that came out just in the last 2 years were 40% of young people, and they're talking about 13 to 18-year-olds identify as LGBTQ. Now, obviously, we've added categories for people to identify as, so that increases it. But this point of junior higher, this is huge, that junior hires now, by and large, all of them identify as that. And one of the interesting questions to ask your youth pastor friend and to ask people who are working with junior hires who say this is, are any of them having sex? Because the answer is probably not, right? I mean, increasingly, preteens and teenagers don't talk to each other anyway. They just text, right? So they don't even like to be physically proximate. They just want to text with each other. But so where is this coming from? They're not sexually active. Why are they identifying as a sexual category in one of these ways? And the answer is critical theory. The answer is not critical theory as an academic theory. It's the critical theory mood, where what we've done is not only introduce these new categories of what it means to be human, we've said that certain of them are good categories and certain of them are bad. This is the critical theory mood. If you belong to this category of person, then you're morally superior. If you belong to this category, you're in that oppressor group. This is now being applied to sexual categories, and parents need to understand that. This is the additional force. It's not just that there's this other option, and you know, kids have been exposed to gay pornography, so they might, you know, be attracted to this or that or the other. What it is we have a culture now that treats heterosexuality as something morally inferior to an alternative sexual identity, that treats being cisgender, which is a word that shouldn't even exist, but refers to people who continue to identify with the sex that, quote unquote, they were assigned at birth, that they're morally inferior to people who aren't on the to people who aren't trapped in a gender binary. So that force creates another so that reality creates another side of pressure for junior hires in particular. And they're sensing it, that they want to be on the good team, not on the bad team. Mm-hmm. And that's been decided. So that's why, this issue, even when we wrote Practical Guide to Culture, was important, but it wasn't like it is today because of the settled science stuff and the critical theory choosing sides for them.
Think about how insidious this is. Okay, so now you have junior hires who are being catechized by the culture to think of identity, and to think of identity primarily in sexual terms, right? Mm-hmm. In sexual categories, non-binary or lesbian or gay or bisexual or trans or whatever. And this is what they're getting from very young ages now. And we're seeing this stuff now pushed, of course, down into elementary. And they are just being catechized by this to where you have a whole youth group or all the students at a more conservative charter school or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I think this is actually a good argument against the salt and light argument that we hear from a lot of Christian parents who say, we need to keep our kids, in these public institutions to be salt and light. Well, okay, I'm open to that argument, but let's look at the results. The results are, we're not being salt and light. No, the culture is being salt and light with their ideas and their values and their worldview. And we are losing kids. Think about all of the unraveling that we're going to have to do with kids who grow up in Christian homes, and yet they're identifying with these categories by the time they're middle schoolers. Mm-hmm. And so I think, as just really practically from a parent's view and the church's view, we may need to shift and think of much deeper protection of our kids very early on, so that we are the ones who are able to catechize them. We are the ones who are able to, pass on the Christian faith, inculcate a deep and strong Christian worldview, so that our kids can actually be salt and light. They're just not prepared for this kind of stuff. Adults are not prepared for this. Right. Parents all the time are saying, I don't know what to do with this, except, and it's hitting them in their very own homes with their own kids. And so, my kid is now wanting to identify as this, and I don't know what to do except, and this is what you hear, well, I know I just got to love them. I just got to love them. Mm-hmm. And that is, in one sense, well, duh, of course, you got to love your kid. But in another sense, it's like, okay, what do you even mean by love? Mm-hmm. And what does it look like to love our kids and also love a culture that this is the idea that has run amok. This is what's taken over. Mm-hmm. How do you love those people? And it may look different to love my neighbor who's struggling with their identity and now is identifying as trans versus loving my kid who I have special obligations to, obligations to God to raise this child in a certain kind of way. And so those two might look very different. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I think that's conflated. And then we have these very shallow definitions of love, that turn out to be mere affirmation and acceptance. And that's certainly not going to help our kids. In fact, we know in marriage, right, if you have that as your definition of love when you go into marriage, you're in for all kinds of trouble. But you could work on affirming me a little bit more. No, if that's what love was, gosh, we'd be in a world of hurt. Sometimes love requires some fight. Sometimes love requires, speaking the truth, saying things that people don't like. And that's what we have to do, I think, in this cultural moment, is we really need to evaluate what do we do here?
Well, and I think, what you brought up about the school and how, no, we're not going to teach transgender. What did you call it? Transgender. No.
They said they weren't going to teach gender theory. They weren't going to actually argue about it. But when a real situation arose, they were going to enforce a predetermined conclusion.
Which is the C.S. Lewis thing of the assumed ideas. And so I think we've got to learn and educate ourselves as parents and anybody dealing with this cultural moment to be able to understand the terms, understand the origin story that we started with. But so let's talk about terms. Let's talk about gender, because you hear gender is a social construct. Like that's a, common thing that goes around. Dr. Angela Franks says that gender, because we are embodied beings, gender is sex, like our biological sex, lived out in the world. So thoughts on that? What is gender? What do we mean by that? And is gender something that changes? Is it fluid? Kind of what our culture says. Is it just socially constructed? Is it stereotypes?
Gender is a loaded concept, and there's going to be listeners who rightly say gender is a bogus word. It was the first bogus word before cisgender was a bogus word. And I think there's a strong argument to be made because it actually absolutizes, at least in the initial idea, things that were very much culturally contingent, very much disconnected from biological realities. And, gender then was treated, there was this time period when it was just, you talked about sex, you talked about men and women, and then it was, well, gender is how we express that, and so that shouldn't be absolutized in a cultural setting. And then it was, well, gender is a social construct, but sex is biology. I still hear people argue that as if that's where the conversation is. I'm just telling you, most people think the whole thing's a social construct. They think sex is a social construct. They think gender is a social construct. I think gender is still a helpful concept to wrestle with because of what that definition, and I think this is John Paul II's theology of the body really articulated kind of this goodness of the created self, and this is the task of Christian apologetics on this role right now, is to help people love their bodies, to know that the body actually is a good thing. And this is such an ironic twist of fate from the 20th century, because the 20th century we were dealing primarily with scientific naturalism and secularists who were saying, oh, you Christians, you don't live in the real world, you live in the fantasy world, and you're so heavenly minded, you're no earthly good. And now we're the ones going, hey, you have a body part, and it actually says something about you. So I think we need to be really clear about what we mean. Sex is a biological category. Gender is in and of itself a word that just refers to a multitude of ways in which people can live out their humanness. And to be human is to be sexed. To be human is to be male or female. And I know people are going to be like, well, what about intersex and all that? Look, a very extremely rare exception does not disprove the rule. It proves the rule, right? Somebody born without an arm does not suddenly we do not assume, well, not all humans have two arms. Humans have two arms. That's the norm. It's okay to say that is the norm. Humans are sexed. To be human is to be male or female. And that has all kinds of biological realities baked in, from procreative potential, to bone density and mass and size that help build a society together. And then that reflects in non-physical, purely physical categories as well. So, Look, sex is so really one of the core issues here that we can see, because it's been denied, is the denial of the physical self and the denial of physical reality. This is an old heresy called Gnosticism, and the body matters. The body determines whether we're male or female. How that's lived out has some cultural applications, but it's rooted back in these unchangeable categories of male and female.
Yeah, I think kind of some of what you're talking about, John, is strategic concerns, right, on kind of moving forward on this, because do we accept some of the current conversation on this? Because some would say, yeah, gender is just this kind of made up thing. So you have sex, and this is the distinction we have in the culture. Sex really refers to biology, how we're organized biologically, and particularly in respect to reproduction, right? Gender is not biology, it's psychology. So this is how one identifies and then presents himself to the world as either male or female. So you got the biology and you got the psychology. And I think there's some conversation to be had. Should we accept that? That's where the culture's at. So strategically, do we try to go back and try to erase that distinction and say, no, they're kind of one and the same, or they're so tightly interconnected, that we don't need this separate, category of gender. Strategically, this is the cultural conversation is there, and this is how people understand it. So I think, I'm open to the arguments, but I think this is where the cultural mindset is, right? And I think maybe strategically what's better for us to do is to say, okay, you've got biology and you've got psychology, you got sex and you got gender. All right, so then what's gender dysphoria? Gender dysphoria is when someone feels discomfort with their biological sex. And so this is the idea of I'm a man trapped in a woman's body, or vice versa. Okay. And so then what does the culture come in and do? The culture adds this now other category. So when you've got sex, you've got biology, you've got psychology, now you have gender dysphoria. Okay, let's add this other category, trans or transgender, right? And this is the view that you are what you think you are. Okay, so if you feel that discomfort, if you have gender dysphoria, well, that is clear evidence that you are that thing that you feel like you are, right? And then I think John hit on this. The key here is there's a disconnection of the psychology from the biological, right? There's a disconnection. There's a repudiation of the biology, of the biological design. And I think maybe part of the question we should be asking is, okay, do we have any good reason to pull those things apart and to say, hey, if your psychology or your mental states don't match up with your biology, should we then just go with your mental states, right? We should just go with what you identify as. And that might be a good place to pound away at, because we have all kinds of counter examples to this, right? So you have the anorexic girl who, she there's a truth to her biology. She's 80 pounds, right? And she's starving. And yet her psychology, her mental states don't match up with the biology. She looks in the mirror, and instead of seeing an 80-pound girl who's starving, she actually sees this overweight, obese, view and doesn't like it and wants to change it. Okay, so in that situation, what do? Do we affirm the mental state? Do we affirm the psychology? Do we affirm the ideas that she's come to hold about herself? No, we actually go after those things, and we don't treat the biology, we treat the psychology, we treat the mind, because we say there's some disconnect here, there's something wrong in the situation. Or people who have what's called body identity disorder, where they feel like they should not have certain limbs, right? And I for whatever reason, they don't feel like they should have a right arm. They go into a doctor, hey, can you amputate this? Well, what do we say? Yeah, okay, let's go ahead and go with what you think. Let's chop your arm off. No, we say, well, okay, what's going on here? Let's deal with this through therapy or counseling, or, let's deal with the psychology. And so, I think we need to push back on this and say, why is this the one instance where we're going to say, all right, you identify this way. Let's just go with your identity. And now think about this too. This is like the only situation where someone can go into a doctor with a self-diagnosis and say, doc, here's my self-diagnosis, now treat me. And the doctor says, okay. Like if I go into my doctor tomorrow and say, doc, I feel like I got cancer and I'm starting to identify as a cancer patient. So can you go ahead and give me chemo and radiation? They're going to look at me like I'm crazy. But in this situation, this is the one situation where you can self-diagnose as the patient, and your self-diagnosis is what determines the treatment, the course of treatment that the doctor is going to put you on.
And as a kid.
Yeah.
Well, the diagnosis itself is inconsistent too, right? Because we say that gender categories, gender constructs are illegitimate. That's what we were told for the last 30 years from various feminist voices. Yeah. How does someone know that they're transgender? Well, because they like the things that are typically identified with the other gender. This is what we tell kids. Oh, you like trucks and you're a little girl, you're probably a boy. So here are the gender stereotypes that were supposed to be completely bogus, that aren't tied to biology whatsoever. And they are the determining factor now that someone was born into a wrong body. Yeah. There's not a single issue that I can think of culturally where we're more just bizarrely inconsistent on a logical or a rational basis than the transgender issue right now.
And it's okay. I mean, I think let's call it what it is. This is insanity. This really is. And I think this is where we as the church and believers, we need to stand up in the culture, no matter how unpopular it is. And, we need to call this out, in loving and gracious terms in certain arenas, but in other arenas, it might just be standing firm for the truth. It's just standing firm as everyone is running past us and jumping off the cliff, right? Well, part of our obligation, I think, in this situation is just to bear witness to the truth and be faithful in that. Because, a lot of us feel like, well, okay, what do you do in this situation?
Okay. Yeah, that's what.
Can I say one more thing?
Okay. Yes.
Before I
Finish
lose
your
this
thought,
really
yes.
deep, important thought. No, I think, what John was talking about, these stereotypes is true,
Yeah.
right? And this is where you constantly see in the schemes of the devil, right? There's always truth that's contained in the larger lie that some people, that help make the lie appealing. And so here, you act like you're a little girl and you're playing with trucks, or you're kind of like aggressive, or you want to play sports with the boys or whatever, or you're a girl and you're more of a tomboy, right, kind of thing. Well, the lie from the culture is, this represents a gender spectrum, right? So you can go all the way from male to female and everything in between, and that's all on the same spectrum. And the truth of the matter is there is a spectrum, but the spectrum is within masculinity, and there is a spectrum within femininity, so that you have the rough and tumble boy all the way to the more sensitive boy. But all the way from those two ends of the spectrum, it's all masculine. It's all males, right? And then with the girls, you've got your whatever, your what do you call them? Girly girls all the way to tomboys, but it's all feminine all the way throughout. They're all females. And you see the deception is in taking that and saying, oh no, actually let's do away with those, and let's now just make it one big gender spectrum.
Yeah.
Can I jump in on this
Yeah.
point? Because to me, there's so much here that needs to be just reinforced. And there's a remarkable example in my work, and looking at the issue of marriage and same-sex marriage, and I, spoken on this since before the Obergefell decision. The maybe the most researched and documented realities of parents and children is that the single most reliable predictor of a child's long-term success is that they're in home with married mom and dad. And as we continue to learn, moms and dads parent differently. Ryan Anderson puts it this way: there's really not parents. At least the research tells us it's not really parents. There's moms and dads. Mm-hmm. There's people who mom, there's people who dad. No, so I talk about this. And a lot of times students who have confused what it means to be on the masculine spectrum and what it means to be on the female spectrum, and what it means to express maleness, will say something like, well, in fact, I get this question once a year at least. What about a lesbian couple? Because one tends to be more masculine and one tends to be more feminine. Isn't that bringing the same thing? Here's what's fascinating about the research. The research doesn't tell us that a child will do well if they have one parent who's a lumberjack and another who, makes cookies. Mm-hmm. It doesn't tell us if it has one who's really sensitive and thoughtful and the other who is rough and tumble and, makes them disciplined. It tells us they need a male and a female in their lives, and that a male is a dad and a female is a mom. In other words, we call this spectrum masculine and feminine, but it's ways of being male and it's ways of being female, and we have this vision of what it means to be human that Scripture gives us, which is stewarding God's creation and doing it in virtuous ways, in ways that love God and love our neighbor. And outside of that, when it comes to, whether someone's more creative or whether someone's more constructive or whether someone is, rough, whether someone's rough and tumble or whether someone likes to read, like none of that matters when kids need a mom and a dad. They need a mom and a dad. They don't need a dad who, who's a professional athlete and a mom who, isn't. I don't know. They just need a mom and a dad. So it's like the male and female that Scripture begins with and describing the whole story of the world is baked into the world like gravity. Like it is not a speed limit. It's not something that changes as so society changes. It is gravity. It is immutable. It's unchangeable. And we continue to see that play itself out on the tail end. And when you deny those things, it causes problems. You're living against the function and the design. I always found that fascinating because it's not that kids need a masculine parent and a feminine parent. Kids need a mom and a dad. They need a male and a female somehow biologically connected with them. That is the ideal. It always has been.
Yeah, I think though what the insight of the masculine feminine spectrum helps us to do is in parenting, so that we don't, because what the cultural narrative is, oh, your boy is more sensitive, he likes the arts, he's whatever. Okay, he's really a girl in a boy's body. And I think what we need to do as parents, as males and females, is to affirm their maleness and their femaleness wherever they are on that spectrum. So yes, they absolutely need a male and a female, and those children need to be affirmed in their own maleness and femaleness. And so, but it also informs us on maybe what that particular kid needs versus another kid. One boy is more rough and tumble and might not need as much of the affirmation. Like, of course, all kids need affirmation, but might not need as much affirmation, particularly in this cultural moment, as the more sensitive boy, who then goes off to school or is surrounded by other adults who put ideas in his head and say, well, maybe you're gay, or maybe you're really a girl, right? And so we in our homes, as the males and as the females, need to be affirming those kids on that spectrum, of the different, how they express themselves or whatever, affirming, and you're a male. And you are a female, and you were designed by God. And so I think that's where the insight is helpful for parents out there who are maybe struggling with this and are going to now be surrounded by a culture that says, oh, your kid's like that. Oh, your kid, gives into these certain stereotypes. Oh, well, this is what they are then.
Yeah. And the danger is in what's happening is that everything we've been talking about, detaching the biology with the psychology, and that we're just going on feelings, right? And so it's feelings is what's ruling the day. And then so going back to where I was going to jump in earlier is just like, okay, so what do we do as Christians? Because like this is what Carl Trueman talks about in his book, Strange New World. But he says, so once identity is psychologized, which is completely what has happened. So it's all just what we think in our head. Anything that is seen to have a negative impact upon someone's psychological identity can potentially come to be seen as harmful, even as a weapon that does serious damage. And I think he's right about how it's shifted. And so that charter school, they're going to affirm that student, because if they don't affirm, that's basically, you could be causing serious damage to that child. And so, okay, so that's where we're at. So as Christians, how do we love people around us when the language has been hijacked, identity's been completely detached from biology? And then, of course, we think about our own kids, but, a grandparent who's listening, whose grandson is going through this. Although, and then not that boys aren't going through this, but what was particularly struck me about the youth pastor story that I mentioned in the beginning is that it's all the girls in the youth group. And this issue in transgenderism in particular seems to be targeting girls in a way that is different than boys. And Sarah and I both read Irreversible Damage by Abigail Schreier. And her research shows that 70% or more of surgeries are performed on girls, women, to have their bodies changed and basically mutilated, I would argue. So that's a big question, but, how do we how do we act in kindness? How do we even talk in this culture?
Well, and another little side note to that question is that it's not just that we're talking about ideas here. I mean, these ideas have grabbed hold of human beings and they're walking with them hand in hand down to destruction. So it's like the church throughout all of history has done what John calls victim care. And like, here we go. We've got all these victims and we're hearing stories of them in their 20s going, wait a second, like I went through all of this permanent damage and why didn't anybody stop me? And so, you know, I think there's a couple layers to that question because one is just speaking truthful language. Like I think some of the words that we even use, we've adopted without even realizing it. Like you mentioned cisgender earlier, or even the word transgender. That's not a reality. And so how do we speak truthfully? And then how do we, like, what does it mean to do victim care right now?
I think one of the most important things we can do right now are tell those stories, right? And tell the stories that actually reflect reality. So one thing I've been doing is collecting detransitioner stories. These are individuals who have gone through the transition, have cut off healthy body parts, have taken the hormones and the testosterone, and now they're coming out of it. And they're telling their stories of all of the damage that it did. And they're telling their stories of not just the damage that it has done to them, physically and emotionally, but they're also talking about how people affirm them all the way through. And some of them are crying out saying, why didn't anyone say anything different? And then there's some stories I've read where it was this, this one girl in particular, a teenage girl who's going through the transition and everyone's just kind of going along with her. And it kind of towards the end of her transition period, she didn't go all the way through with things, but it was her grandfather who pulled her aside and with tears in his eyes said, what are you doing? He was the only one kind of courageous enough to speak the truth. And that snapped her out of it. And, her conversation with her grandfather, who was the only one to kind of stand firm. And so I think we need to tell these stories of the harm that is coming because of these ideas, right? We talk about this all the time. Ideas have consequences. I think, and that's one of the things we have on our side on this is we have God's reality. Reality is on our side. And so you hold false views about human beings, about identity, about flourishing and what's going to make us happy. And you will run into a wall eventually. And that's what's happening. In fact, I just saw a headline. I get to chase this down, but now I think over in the UK, there's like 1,000 parents who are joining in a lawsuit against a gender clinic because of all the damage that's being done. So we need to highlight and amplify those kind of stories to maybe help wake up the culture. Because I think there's a lot of people out there who aren't buying into this, right? But they're silent on it because they know that if they speak out on it, they're going to get blowback. And these detransitioners who are telling their stories are getting tons of hate from kind of the activists and those who are pushing this. So if we can come and support them in telling those stories, we can help, get people to start questioning the cultural narrative on this. And then I think another thing that we can do is talk more explicitly about the goodness of being male and female. And as I think about that, I'm not sure I've really ever had that conversation with my boys. I'm just kind of assumed but I don't know if I've ever explicitly said to the boys, you know what? I like being a man. I like my maleness. I like the different aspects of it, and it doesn't mean that somehow, females are any less valuable, but I am thankful to God that I'm a man. I'm thankful to God that mom is a female, right? And maybe modeling for our communities and our families and our kids. Hey, there's an appropriate sense of joy and happiness and pride that I have in the way that God has designed me. And I think maybe in this day and age, we have to be more explicit in saying those kinds of things and even asking our kids, what do you think about being a boy? What do you think about being a girl? To kind of monitor where they're at on all this. Because this used to be, this used to be something that was just assumed, and that no longer is assumed.
America is quickly becoming an outlier on this. And that's why it's so important to know, like, you're not the crazy one, because the rest of the world is backpedaling. Much of the rest of the world is backpedaling. Those
And when
countries,
you say you're not the crazy one, who are you talking about?
I mean you.
Yeah.
No, I mean, if you actually think that this new gender ideology is bizarre and absurd and crazy and harmful, you're not the crazy one. And I think when you just get kind of this repeated banging on the drum of this idea, it's easy to just get really quiet and think, well, maybe I missed something. Maybe there's something here. What's happening around the rest of the world is really important. There are more detransitioners because it's longer in the life cycle of this idea, and especially young girls who oftentimes in adolescence and puberty have a hard time figuring out their own bodies and liking who they are and so on. Anyway, this gives them a way out. This gives them a social belonging. This gives them a sense of being something special. And it was a bad idea. And it's funny. Most people don't know about these detransitioners. They need to. When I bring this up, people are like, "Oh yeah, like Walt Heyer." I'm like, "Well, yeah, but he's 80 years old.
Yeah.
That's a great story." What you don't know is that there are hundreds of 20-year-old girls who are doing this, and this case in the UK is going to be huge. And it's one example. We've talked a lot though about parenting, which is important. I've got some thoughts on parenting to reinforce this. I think your ideas are good, but and also kind of like being a voice of truth in our culture. But I want to maybe raise the stakes a little bit. One of our resident instructors here at the Colson Center is Glenn Sunshine. Not that he lives here resident, but he's always around. He's a historian. He does a lot on how Christians have influenced culture throughout history. One of the things he's intentionally done has been diverse in age and ethnicity and what century they lived and their calling and vocation, whether they were pastors or whether they were politicians and all kinds of
Beer
things.
makers.
Or beer makers. The thing that so many of them have in common, though, is, other than Christ, is that they believed that their Christianity demanded that they protect children. It's fascinating. We got to save children from prostitution. We got to save children from being a religious slave. We've got to protect these children from this or that or the other, from being chained up in the factories, or whatever. There are so many Christians who think that to be loving is to be affirming. To be loving is to be quiet. To be loving is not to offend. That is allowing children to be led to the slaughter. Like, what is at risk in this issue is the health and well-being of children. Every generation of Christian has had to protect children. Why would we think we would be any different? This is our issue. I get why it's so scary to step out on this, because you will get your neck chopped off, and you need a theology of getting fired. And it's one thing to be thought of as being old-fashioned and traditional. It's another thing to be thought of as being Hitler. And that's what this one is. But got to protect the rights and well-being of children. Like, you got to. Like, what are we doing? We would never stand around as children are sexually trafficked and say, my faith has nothing to do with that. Why are we standing around saying, my faith has nothing to do with the sexual experimentation being conducted on a whole generation of junior high girls? Like, it's insane. We'd never stand for that, and we can't stand for that here.
Yeah. I think what John is saying is really important, but I want to raise the stakes here a little bit more above what he said. What's the best way to protect our children? No, but I think there's a synergy here. What's the best way to protect our children? The best way to protect our children is strong families. There is nobody who has more investment in kids than biological mom, biological dad, parenting together. It's the best protection. But I think what this brings up is the the different institutions that we have here, I think that we need to talk through. Maybe not in this podcast, but in the church, we have the institution of family, and there are particular things that we need to do for that particular institution. Then we've got the institution of the church, and this is where maybe churches have shied away from advocating for certain public policies, right? Because that's quote unquote too political. And so we need to, we need to address things like that within the institution of the church, because the institution of the church can maybe have a little more of an impact, or can organize Christians in a way that you as an individual family sit there and go, what do I do? How do I do this? And of course, we can be entrepreneurial in terms of, starting organizations that go in and try to rescue children from, sex trafficking or something like that. But then collectively together in churches, there's strength in numbers. And so what do we do as churches? And then there's the institution of the state. And what is our strategy there? And I think thinking through all of those things, because I think because of some of our views, this overly privatized personal relationship with Jesus that our Christianity gets reduced to, it cuts us off from these important institutions where we can have real cultural impact. And we need to understand that our faith is in one sense, there is a privateness to our personalness. I think personal is probably a better word. Our faith is personal, and our faith is also public. And there's these public things that we need to do, like protect children, fight for children. And so thinking through what are our strategies in those different areas, and they're going to be different in some ways. There may be some overlap that we see, but I think the church in this moment really needs to think through those kinds of things.
Well, you think about the pro-life movement and how they have hit it from all different angles. So I think it makes me think of the Colson Center's questions of what's good that can be promoted, what's missing that can be added, what's broken that can be mended, and what's evil that must be stopped. And I think we can ask ourselves those questions in our spheres of influence about this topic. And they'll, like, for example, what's good that can be promoted? Well, how can we bolster up the families? And, like what Maven does, here's resources, here's ways to talk about this with your kids. Here's ways to understand it yourself. And so we can bolster up the families. Like, there's all these different angles that we have to come at it with. And we have to think about what's in our responsibility, what's in our sphere of influence to do. But okay, I want to ask a question. How would you, going back to that story about, here's a family who has gone to this charter school their whole life. It's a classical charter school. Probably a lot of Christian teachers, because a lot of classical charter schools have Christian teachers. And here this kid is a junior in high school. What do you advise them? What do you advise them as a student if they're stuck there? Or what do you advise them as parents with this choice?
The first thing I say, and this is like the bottom line commitment that we can all make, and that is don't lie. Don't tell a lie. And when you're asked to tell a lie, don't tell a lie. When you're asked to be co-opted into a lie, because everyone just assumes that it's not a lie, it's still a lie, don't tell a lie. And this, of course, goes to Solzhenitsyn's point, live not by lies. It's like, you don't have to fight every battle. You don't have to be, we don't need this kid necessarily making a big public scene of every different scenario. There's ways to do it quietly. And so I really think in fact, I think there's kind of an equation here that parents and kids need to have, assuming that there's a strong understanding of what it means to be male and female, strong catechism and what is true, and a solid grounding, is two things. Number one is don't lie. And number two is what Paul says, as much as lies within you, live at peace with everybody. And these are really two hard things to put together right now. Because if you don't lie, you won't be at peace with everyone. But that's okay, because don't lie. As much as you can do, live at peace. So how we talk and so on matters, but just don't lie and don't be a jerk. The other thing is parents, I think way more important is for parents. I was speaking to a parent about this the other day, and he's like, yep, I know it's going to happen with my kid. we've made this choice. I don't like it. My kid knows when teacher says this, this, and this, that's when they raise their hand and say, I'm out. I need to leave the room. I need to go to the principal's office. And they know at that point, they call me and I'm on my way, right? In other words, the kid needs to know that the parent has their back. Now, my gut level reaction is get them out of the school and get them somewhere else. I mean, that's just, I think we're quickly reaching that point if we haven't reached it already. In some places, clearly reached it already. But the very level, if you're going to ask your kid to stand up or expect your kid to be clear morally on this, they need to know you have their back and that you're the first one in the car. And, you know, that you're going to protect them. And I think, or at least stand up for them as much as you can. There's a wonderful story right now out of Loudoun County. Of course, how many stories are there coming out of Loudoun County? This is a great one of a dad doing that with his kid. And his kid was very clear morally on where he stood. He stepped out. The dad stood by him. And they didn't buy this, you know, all is lost and there's nothing we can do. We're just going to lay low and we're going to buy into, you know, this. We can't really say anything or we'll get in trouble. No, I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to be a jerk. Parents got our back. We can start there. I think we're in pretty good shape.
You know, I think to add to that, knowing your kid is going to inform you what maybe decision you need to make in that kind of situation. So do you think that kid, that junior in high school, has the fortitude, has the strength to live not by lies, right? And there are some that do. But what I'm finding is that the majority of Christian kids, you know, that I'm speaking to aren't there yet. You know, the social pressure is so overwhelming and so overpowering that they don't have that ability to do that, or they'll give in. If your kid's like that, then that's going to inform maybe what you do. That might be the time where you need to say, I'm going to have to remove them from that situation. And so you got to be honest about where your kid's at. Like I'm just thinking of our 5 kids. I mean, it's so different in their personalities, where there could be a couple of them who I'd say, yeah, they kind of don't give a rip about what people think, you know, and they have just these very strong convictions about what's right and wrong. And there's downsides to that where they see everything in black and white and they're very judgmental on other people, right? But we know that in that situation, I got a lot of confidence that kid, they wouldn't give in to the lie. I've got other kids that are much more people oriented and they're great people and everyone loves them and they're so relational. And I know in that situation, because of their disposition, man, it's going to be really tough for them to stand firm in that situation. And that kid, I might need to say, hey, I've got to get them out of that environment because they just don't have the moral strength and the moral conviction to do that yet. So part of it is just being honest and knowing your own kid and saying, okay, where are they at in this situation? Maybe they need just more time to develop strength, conviction, you know, their views on this. And that might mean you got to pull them out. You got to make the real hard decision to pull them out and figure something else out.
Well, I hope this conversation was helpful to those of you listening. Of course, we talk a lot to parents specifically today, but also I hope even the young single gal who might be listening can think about maybe some junior high girls that she should reach out to and start checking in with weekly, having lunch with them, affirming what you were talking about, Brett, about, hey, isn't it great to be a woman? And
listen to the podcast, the Strong Women
podcast together. And also what you're saying, John, of just having in our minds, it is a time to protect children as followers of Christ. And how can I do that? Retired senior citizens in a neighborhood can protect the kids in they can start loving, reaching out to the kids. I mean, my mind's kind of spinning on all the options and ways that we can, as a church, start protecting and loving, especially the young people that this gender conversation in the culture is particularly confusing. So thank you, husbands of ours, for coming on and talking about this topic. And we're going to wrap up the Strong Women podcast, but we're going to continue the conversation a little bit over at the Maven Parent podcast on just real practical ways to help our kids to form proper views of God, of who they are, of where we kind of fit in God's story, and those sorts of things. So you can hop over there if you want to hear the rest of this conversation. But thanks, Brett and John, for being on the Strong Women podcast today, not being too intimidated to come on and be with Sarah and I again.
It's a privilege to be a strong woman.
Maven exists to help the next generation know truth, pursue goodness, and create beauty for the cause of Christ. To find out more, check out maventruth.com.